Hello, my name is Derek Coe, and welcome to the Secular Monastic, where we explore all things related to religion and spirituality. No supernatural beliefs required. And today I want to close out my three-part series on my personal faith journey. If you missed parts 1 and 2, I have linked them below, but to recap, part 1 explored the reasons why I lost my faith and my journey out of evangelical Christianity, and part 2 explored my angry atheist phase and the ways I moved past it and have learned to respect thoughtful and nuanced people of faith despite my religious trauma. And today's episode, part 3, will focus on why I have nonetheless kind of never found religious faith again. And to start, I think I want to just be really clear to everybody, especially religious folks, that none of what I say today is meant to be an indictment of your personal faith and your personal beliefs. I say that because I will be discussing my continued reasons for doubting not just Christianity, but any supernatural system of beliefs. And as a formerly religious atheist of 13 years, it has been my experience that even just sharing one's own doubts and questions can be perceived by other people as attacks on their kind of like beliefs and their certainty. And, conservative Christians and conservative religious people are kind of more susceptible to this, but liberal and otherwise open-minded people of faith can also kind of be susceptible to this, right? Like they're not immune to it. And I just do want to challenge you if you have these sorts of knee-jerk reactions to those sharing to people who kind of like ask questions openly and share their doubts openly. If you are confident in your faith and you either kind of do not share the doubts of non-believers, or you have kind of sufficient comfort and peace of mind in your faith that, even sharing those doubts doesn't pose a problem to your faith or your religious identity, I think it's worth examining why you react so fiercely to doubts expressed by other people who are just trying to tell their personal stories and sharing their personal perspectives. So, with that out of the way, I want to start by talking about my attempts to explore faith and religion after leaving my former evangelical Christian church, because I did in fact make many attempts to do so. This may surprise some folks who saw my previous video about the ways in which my religious trauma led me to judge superstition, faith, and kind of unproven belief of all forms very harshly in my first few years as an atheist. But the reason that this did not prevent my study and exploration of other faiths and kind of my open-mindedness to religious ideas is partly because I did not believe in emulating the common evangelical Christian strategy of frankly just avoiding learning about diverse perspectives and ideas in order to preserve my own beliefs. The way I saw it, it made sense for me to explore the ideas of other faith traditions before drawing conclusions about them, and even ideas that seemed absurd on the surface should sometimes be examined more closely, because after all, I used to see atheism and many secular ideas and beliefs I now hold as absurd. Even if a belief system seemed superstitious and unproven, I almost felt as if I should at least be somewhat informed about its specifics before judging it, and in order to judge it, a little bit more, judge it in a better way, and in a more informed way. This intellectual curiosity led me to research the other great world religions, including Islam, Hinduism, and Buddhism. I explored also the Jewish roots of Christianity, and I even looked into smaller faith traditions and religious movements like Sikhism, Jainism, and Zoroastrianism. I will not be able to cover my exploration of every single one of these traditions in this video. All I will say is that while I will not claim to be an expert in all of these traditions or claim to have read all of their scriptures in full, which is honestly just nearly impossible considering how extensive scriptures are in some traditions, especially Buddhism and Hinduism. I'm looking at you guys. Despite that, I did gain an understanding of the basic doctrines and beliefs and philosophical outlooks of various religions and even the dominant denominations, sects, and schools of thought within each major religion. So I also want to say that I want to dedicate a future video to my exploration of specifically non-Abrahamic faith traditions. So that's religions outside of broadly kind of Christianity, Judaism, and Islam. In the future, in particular, I want to dedicate a video to why I didn't, or let's say, why I have not yet joined the Buddhist faith tradition, as well as my thoughts on secular Buddhism and the differences in the ways Buddhism tends to be understood and practiced by native-born practitioners, specifically kind of like typically in South Asia, Southeast Asia, and East Asia, and Western converts in places like North America and Europe. And, broad generalizations here, but there are some like trends in the differences. In which in how kind of like Buddhism is understood by these two populations. However, this particular video will focus very heavily on Abrahamic religions, and specifically my reasons for not returning to Christianity, including more open, thoughtful, and liberal forms of Christianity. And I titled this video A Letter to Liberal Christians because I have generally had very unsatisfying discussions with liberal Christians in the past. And while, as I will share in a bit, I think this is partly due to some of my liberal Christian friends just being somewhat ill-equipped to, have these discussions and not being kind of sufficiently well-versed in philosophy, theology, and even the Bible to answer my concerns. Part of it was definitely due to me being the archetypal disappointed Christian turned angry atheist. And I think that is unfortunate on both sides. But I think I am also now in a place where I not only have respect for nuanced liberal Christianity, but also have knowledge and understanding of nuanced Christian thought, and better able to explain to liberal Christians why even a faith tradition and even certain, beliefs that secular liberal atheists can respect can still just seem utterly implausible to us. And, I have similar thoughts when it comes to kind of like Buddhist faith, right? Like, there are lots of parts of Buddhism that really deeply resonate with me. And yet when it comes to certain beliefs, specifically the supernaturalist beliefs held by, the vast majority of Buddhists, both, historically and presently, that's not like, a part of the faith that I can adopt. And, put a pin in that for now, because I know there are going to be a lot of like secular Buddhists who like are chomping at the bit to tell me that like, that's not essential to Buddhism. Story for another time. And when I first became an atheist, right, like I did start, not with a tradition like Buddhism, but by exploring different denominations of Christianity, specifically liberal Christian churches and even Reformed Jewish theology, which I saw as wrestling with a lot of the same questions of historical and biblically rooted cruelty and social oppression. And I also drew on the perspectives of friends of mine who were Reformed Jews and liberal Christians. And I should say that in this very early part of my exploration, I spoke mostly to the laity, that is to normal people who attend like church and synagogue, not to actual ministers, theologians, and rabbis who tend to have much deeper understandings of scripture, doctrine, and religious philosophy. It was not until years later when I found academics, PhD Bible scholars, ministers, and experts on rabbinical Judaism online that I gained some deeper understanding of liberal perspectives within Judaism and Christianity. However, at the time, and I'm not trying to kind of like broadly generalize or overgeneralize here, but at the time, I did find myself gravitating towards my Reformed Jewish friends more when talking about religion and faith, because broadly speaking, I found a kind of refreshing honesty in their perspectives and their words that felt very new to me, and which I didn't necessarily get from my liberal Christian friends, as nice as they were. To demonstrate what I am talking about, an example might be helpful here. In the Old Testament of the Bible, the prophet Samuel very famously communicates with King Saul that God wishes for the Israelites to wage war on the Amalekites, this desert nomadic tribe, which famously attacks the Hebrews during the Exodus as Moses was leading them through the Sinai Peninsula to the Promised Land. And long story short, King Saul wages war on them, but spares the Amalekite king and their best livestock, while putting every other Amalekite man, woman, child, and every other animal owned by them to the sword. And this causes Saul to lose God's favor because God originally instructed him to leave nobody, human or animal, alive among the Amalekites. This later paves the way for the more famous King David of kind of David and Goliath fame to replace him on the throne of Israel. For a lot of reasons, this story is kind of a bit of a favorite among atheists who critique religion because it is kind of hard to argue in a modern context that God being mad at King Saul for not committing genocide thoroughly enough paints God in a very good light. Unfortunately, leaders of the modern-day state of Israel, including, the wanted war criminal Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, have invoked the memory of the Amalekite genocide in the Bible to justify their ethnic cleansing of Gaza, the West Bank, and more recently, southern Lebanon. And needless to say, how modern people kind of interpret this story is important, and, that's just one small example of that. And there are kind of all sorts of objections that can be lobbed at God's supposed justice in commanding the Israelites to commit this genocide, including protests of the innocence of the Amalekite infants who were also, slaughtered, and, at the very least, right, at the very, very least, the innocence of the Amalekite livestock, because after all, what sins did the sheep and camels commit? How were they guilty, even by heritage and lineage, for previous attacks on the Hebrews? And when I talked to my liberal Christian friends, most of what I heard, when I brought up stories like this was, how do I put this nicely? Hand waving. failed at putting it nicely, unfortunately. But anyway, this is to say, right, like that instead of addressing my concerns head on, they tended to want to bring my attention to kind of like the good verses, right, like of the Bible, like the story of the Good Samaritan and other parts of scripture that seem to illustrate God and Jesus's mercy and compassion, which they would then say they of course try to live by, things including, he who is without sin cast the first stone, like injunctions against like judging others lest you be judged, etc. And of course, I was happy that these friends of mine would not kind of like try to justify these genocides in the Old Testament and other kind of Old Testament atrocities the way the evangelicals I grew up with typically did and felt compelled to do. But I found their answers still just very, very unsatisfying, right? To me, they weren't even answers. If the God of the Bible commanded genocide in the Old Testament, I needed to be able to square that circle in my head, especially if Jesus, despite all his teachings about love and compassion, was supposed to be that very same God, according to kind of like core Christian doctrine. And what it seemed like a lot of my liberal Christian friends were doing was simply adhering to the parts of scripture that resonated with them while ignoring the parts that they weren't comfortable with to create a religion that almost seemed more loving and merciful than its own God actually was. And this was in contrast with some of my Jewish friends who simply said that, they have personal faith and they loved their synagogue community and participating in rituals and holidays like Passovers and bar mitzvahs and bat mitzvahs, but that personally they thought God behaved a bit like a war criminal in the Old Testament on several occasions, not just, when it came to the Amalekites. And many Christians might cringe at the thought of speaking of God in those terms, but these kinds of critiques of God are partly born out of the deep Jewish tradition of arguing and quarreling and wrestling with God, and even questioning him when things that God does or allows to happen do not comport with kind of our deep human senses of justice and mercy and our sensitivity to human suffering. And you see this in the book of Habakkuk and other books of the Old Testament in which prophets argue with God and even openly question the wisdom of God. There is more of a tradition in many Jewish sects of Jews being partners with God and shaping the world and not just passive subjects. Christianity and Islam, on the other hand, and again, I'm speaking in broad strokes and generalizations, and exceptions do exist, but Christianity and Islam, tend to place faith in and even respect for God above these intuitions that we have as human beings, and kind of above our own kind of moral reasoning and understanding. And of course, Christians and Muslims do still wrestle with difficult theological questions and, wrestle with the difficult parts of their scriptures. But the idea of quarreling with God, right, can still seem disobedient and even blasphemous to many of them. The word Christian means follower of Christ in Greek, and the word Muslim literally means, one who submits to God in Arabic. And the word Israel, on the other hand, which traditionally is a demonym of the Jewish people and points to the Jewish people and not just a nation state, literally means one who struggles with God or he who strives with God in the original Hebrew. So while inquiry and contemplation of certain doctrines and ideas is seen as acceptable in Christianity and Islam, and these religions produced genuinely brilliant, great thinkers and philosophers like St. Thomas Aquinas and Avicenna, what has traditionally not been acceptable in these traditions is questioning the goodness and wisdom of God himself. And I think this is why I never heard Christian friends of mine, even those in very open liberal traditions, refer to God as a war criminal, even though he clearly behaves like one in certain parts of the Bible. So in a very real way, I learned to respect the faith of my Reformed Jewish friends much earlier on because of what I saw as their refreshing honesty when it came to not being able to explain things like the cruelty of God in the Bible or the continued existence of cruelty and evil in the world more generally. I mean, many of these friends of mine had grandparents or great-grandparents who, survived the Holocaust. There was certainly less of an appetite among them to rationalize what had happened with apologetics when some of the worst suffering and cruelty of the 20th century was so close to them and so personal to them and their families. There was something so new to me about the way that my liberal Jewish friends, simply said, look, I have faith, but I can't explain the bad stuff. I can't justify the bad stuff. I am not going to try to justify the bad stuff. And in the meantime, I like my community. I like, the rituals of my tradition. I like the aesthetics of my tradition, the awe that it inspires in me. And I like the renegotiated doctrines and beliefs in my religious tradition that provide me a way to govern my life and make it meaningful in the modern era. And what I don't want to do here is simply kind of rehash atheist objections to the most problematic parts of the Bible or rehash the problem of evil for the 500th time on the internet. For those unfamiliar with the problem of evil, it is a problem wrestled with by theologians throughout history, and it asks why evil exists if God is merciful and good, and therefore kind of willing to stop, evil, right? If he's all merciful and good. And if God is all powerful and therefore kind of able to stop it. So if he is willing and able to stop evil, why doesn't he do it? If you watch Alex O'Connor, he does a much better job of kind of tearing down every possible apologetic response and theodicy in response to the problem of evil, and is great at debating intellectually dishonest Christian apologists. And you can pretty easily find that content on YouTube if that's what you're seeking out. That's not really what I'm going to try to do here. What I do want to talk about is how liberal theologians approach the Bible and why, while I have learned to respect their perspectives on many things, this respect has not brought me back to the Christian tradition or back to faith at all. And there are three primary ways in which I have seen liberal theologians approach difficult parts of the Bible. The first of which I will call the progressive revelation or progressive trajectory view. This view, for example, takes a practice like slavery in the Bible and acknowledges its cruelty, but will point to things like the liberation of the Hebrews from Egypt, and, followed by, the progressive, radical, egalitarian doctrine formed in the New Testament from, the teachings of Jesus, and things like Paul's instruction to Philemon to treat his slave no longer as a slave, but as a brother in the book of Ephesians. And they would kind of point to all of this and say that God's revelation is one that bends the arc of biblical narratives and history towards liberation and not oppression. Lots more I can say on that, but again, Alex O'Connor critiques Christian rationalizations for biblical slavery better than I ever can or ever will. So go watch one of his videos if that's what you're looking for. I'm just here to explain the perspective of liberal theologians. The second approach I see is a more historical contextual approach, and this is a liberal hermeneutic approach that is very common when discussing the Bible's perspective on homosexuality. Specifically male homosexuality. So rather than denying that versus addressing homosexual acts between men and condemning these acts exist in the Bible, what some liberal theologians will say is that the historical context of those verses existed was one in which sex carried very heavy meanings of dominance and power. And, things like consent were not kind of like at the forefront of sexual ethics. And it was kind of considered humiliation to take the passive role in general in sex, and especially if you were doing so as part of a male homosexual act, as a man kind of like stooping to the level of a passive role in sex. And, forcing somebody into that passive role in the context of a military conquest or pederasty was far more familiar to the people of the ancient Near East than a conception of a man who fundamentally identifies as homosexual and might even be willing to take kind of the passive sexual role with another man for his own pleasure. In fact, sexual orientation is a very modern concept, and ancient peoples did not use sexual attraction as an identity marker in the way we use it today. So, for what it's worth, all of this is true, and even cultures that famously practice some form of male homosexuality more widely, say Rome or Greece, conceived of gay relationships very, very differently from how we conceive them today. And the idea of a free adult man taking the passive role in a homosexual relationship would have been deeply shamed and even punished far more than it is today, even though those ancient cultures sanctioned those relationships, or at least didn't mind them one bit when they were between adult men and adolescents, for example, as part of a mentorship relationship, or between adult men and male slaves who simply had no rights to refuse. And things like this we would rightfully view today as abuse and criminal and violations of consent. What a liberal theologian might say then is that the Bible has nothing to say about innate same-sex attraction or modern consensual same-sex male relationships, because that was not even a way in which ancient people would have conceived of male homosexuality back then. Therefore, applying those Old Testament condemnations to modern consensual gay relationships and modern gay identities that the people who lived at the time they were written would not have even been able to wrap their heads around fails to apply them to the right target and ignores the historical and cultural context in which those condemnations were written. The third approach is what I will call the esoteric approach, or the non-obvious interpretive approach. And the best example of this is really the Reformed Jewish perspective that was later adopted by many liberal Christians on Abraham's near sacrifice of his son Isaac to God. What liberal theologians will say here is that while older and more orthodox traditions have historically praised Abraham's near murder of his son at the request of God and held it up as a great testament of his faith, this is a misinterpretation, and hidden in the story is the implication that Abraham actually failed God's test by putting aside his own conscience and his own reasoning and blindly obeying. Some progressive rabbis and ministers will even contrast Abraham's blind obedience here with the numerous times he pushed back on God's plans to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah. It may be the case, they would say, that the majority of believers today and the majority throughout history did not interpret this story this way, but the majority interpretation or historical interpretation is not necessarily the correct one. Which, sure, it's hard to disagree with that on its own. And as I discussed in my last video, I no longer see the conservative or more orthodox denominations as having this view of scripture and God that comes from nowhere and simply interprets the Bible and the will of God unvarnished as it is and as it is written. And I now see a lot of intellectual honesty in the way that liberal traditions will openly admit to practicing the negotiation with the text of the Bible to form their doctrines and beliefs, and simply say that, of course you need to apply human reasoning to them in order to interpret them wisely. However, this has not caused me to see the Christian tradition as something more plausible or believable for a simple reason, and it's a reason that I think supersedes any specific doubts and disagreements I have with specific liberal interpretations of specific Bible verses or stories. And I am, of course, talking about the problem of denominations, which I see as a subset of a broader problem, the problem of divine hiddenness. So I will explain that first one and then zoom out. But simply put, the multiplicity of Christian denominations that exists fosters a doubt in me that I simply cannot overcome. if Jerry Falwell Jr. and Jerry Falwell Sr. and J.D. Vance and the late Pope Francis and Bishop Marion Budd and Barack Obama, George W. Bush, James Tallarico, and AOC can all be a part of the Christian tradition, but come to radically different religious viewpoints on some of the most important moral questions facing humanity. That kind of raises an important question, right? Which is, why can't the Christian God, if he exists, clarify what the Christian perspective on those morals questions should be? Why is it left up to us, to decide how we should interpret the story of Abraham's, sacrifice of Isaac, or the verses in Leviticus or Romans or 1 Corinthians that address male homosexual acts? Why can't he answer concerns about slavery and genocide in the Bible and definitively either wave them away as cultural inventions so that, they are not used to continue justifying harm, or on the flip side, confirm that, he actually did command and sanction slavery and genocide and had some good reasons for doing so that he could explain to explain to us himself. Christians do not even include all of the same books in the Bible. And the biblical canon kind of shrinks or expands depending on whether you are a Protestant Catholic, an Eastern Orthodox Christian, or an Ethiopian Orthodox Christian specifically. Why not clarify which books are actually legitimate, inspired scripture and canonical? None of this would impinge on believers' free will either. It would simply clarify the rules, doctrines, and, the corresponding scripture supporting them, so that deep, bitter divides that lead to discord at best and violence at worst do not continue to plague, the different factions and schools of thought among, Christian believers. And the freedom to read his scripture and to follow those rules or not would still very much belong to every individual. And to zoom out and, look at also the multiple schools of thought that exist within Judaism and Islam, whose followers purport to worship and commune with the same God as Christians, or to zoom out still further and take a look at, say, Sikhs and Zoroastrians and most Hindus, all of whom kind of also believe in a creator God, it is pretty undeniable that there are billions of people who earnestly seek God and are open to learning the truth about him, but nonetheless don't find that truth in the Christian tradition. And there are also millions of atheists and agnostics who earnestly seek God or are even raised in the church, but cannot bring themselves to sincerely believe in the Christian God or any God despite earnestly praying, worshiping, and reading scripture. And that brings us to the problem of divine hiddenness. That's the problem in a nutshell. It asks why God chooses to stay hidden to those who seek him, and why those who earnestly seek him remain unconvinced of the existence of God, or arrive at just completely different ideas and beliefs about his opinions and his nature. Moreover, if there is one faith tradition or even one particular church that is closest to God and best at following his rules and knowing his will and nature, why are the billions of people in every other faith tradition, and even those who lack faith, seemingly unable to access the same God and, learn those same teachings? I count myself as one of these so-called non-resistant non-believers who is open and ready to commune with the divine and to experience God or any number of gods who might exist. And I'm someone who wrestles endlessly with ethical questions and is deeply concerned about doing the right thing and behaving consistently according to my own moral rules. But at the end of the day, I understand that the natural physical world doesn't give me answers about right and wrong, and I would love to make contact with a God in whom I could ground some form of morality, and who could clarify for me where my moral reasoning falls short or might be mistaken, or where I might be unaware of room for improvement in the way that I behave and live. Again, this would not affect my agency or free will. I'm absolutely sure I would still struggle to be a good person at times and to do the right thing. And I highly doubt that even with clear instructions from God, I will manage to be perfect. But what these instructions would give me, and all who seek to do right, is moral knowledge and clarity, and denying us that seems entirely pointless and even a little bit cruel. And I am and always have been very sensitive to the suffering and injustice that exists in the world. And I genuinely yearn for a merciful God who can help me and everyone else on this earth alleviate and resolve suffering and injustice. I have read more of the Bible than most Christians. I observe Lent, for goodness sake. And after years as an angry atheist, I have started praying again in the last couple of years. Still, if the God of the universe can hear me, he is meeting me with radio silence, and meanwhile, those who claim or have claimed to hear God's voice, foremost among them, the supposed prophets of various religions, have heard wildly different things and often contradictory instructions and messages. I tend to find people of faith easier to talk to when they are able to acknowledge that the doubts of non-believers like me are not just unreasonable. And more than that, it's our doubts are not necessarily the result of us not wanting or trying to assuage them. One of my favorite friends to have these sorts of discussions with is a friend from college who just finished studying at one of the best theology/divinity schools in the country, and who is a progressive Orthodox Christian who sees the physical world and humanity as a necessary part of who and what God is, and believes all people are called through God's grace and human effort together to emulate the divine and perfect nature of God and therefore be in perfect union with him, a process known as theosis in Eastern Orthodox Christianity. And it's a beautiful interpretation of God and salvation that I don't believe in, but which I have found to be probably one of the most beautiful conceptions of the Christian God that I have ever heard. And because I have discussed in the past the importance of ritual, tradition, and community that religion typically provides for people, and even, the aesthetics and art that can enrich all of these aspects of religion, the importance of that, I have seriously flirted with joining a faith community again in the past, and making that a part of my post-religious spiritual journey, where I am trying to salvage what good things I can pull from the wreckage of my deconstructed evangelical Christian faith. And the biggest thing that holds me back is my expectation that these communities won't necessarily fill my need for spiritual community, precisely because I'm not going to be convinced of the existence of the God most of the rest of the community believes in. And more than that, that I cannot be convinced of any supernatural beliefs, including those like the doctrine of rebirth or reincarnation held by the vast majority of practitioners of Buddhism, who do not even build their faith around belief in an all-powerful creator God. And to be clear, I'm sure I would find lovely people and great friends in these communities, and I already have some great friends from these communities, but our spiritual needs and approaches would nonetheless differ, right? Like, our anxieties about injustice and suffering in the world would manifest differently, our processes for grieving and our method for coping with death would differ, and the meaning behind the various rituals and traditions and even holidays we might, observe and celebrate together would also be qualitatively different. I host a Christmas party every Christmas Eve and even sing deeply religious and spiritual Christian hymns as part of the Seattle Men's Chorus's kind of holiday show every year. That's kind of what two of the four posters behind me are kind of like commemorating, actually. And even so, right, I will never experience any of those things the way that a true believing Christian will, right? Like, our experience of all those rituals and tradition, even that music, will just be qualitatively different because of my lack of belief and their, presence of belief. So for now, I choose to chart a spiritual path of my own that lacks supernatural belief, but nonetheless wrestles with many of the important questions religions have always tried to answer. Things like, how do we know right from wrong? Or what should the purpose of our lives be? And I create my own spiritual narratives that help me cope with the harshness and indifference of the physical universe, without subverting my intellectual integrity and rationality. If along the way I help someone who is stuck in that same no man's land of being immune to faith and supernatural belief, but longing for spiritual fulfillment, all the better. That's, the large part of the reason that I share all of my thoughts here. But, I do feel compelled to say, as a non-resistant non-believer who has been waiting all my life for a sign of the divine, God, if you are watching this video, I just want you to know that you can call me anytime and I'll pick up, I promise. And if I don't, leave a voicemail and I'll get back to you. And to all of the rest of you, thank you for tuning in. I'll see you next time. Bye.